Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, November 30th, 2019. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today we reconvene in our 25th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and the chairman of the committee, and I'm turning this webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Once again, it is a great pleasure for me to be here with you and with our other participants. We are looking forward, I believe, to an extremely interesting discussion. For the purpose of the viewers who may not have been following our series, I would state that today we will almost entirely be reading from an essay that I wrote in June called Living the Real Religion of Jesus, and that it would be very helpful for you to download it from the website of the Committee of the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. The word global endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. Now, the document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, corresponds to a link that is about 2/3 of the way down the page. That essay, the one that we will focus on today, is effectively an insert into the much longer document, Revelation Revealed, that is the basis for this series as a whole. Revelation Revealed is also available on the website just a little bit below the link for Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Now, because you are not able, you the viewer, to ask us any question while we are talking, we offer you the option of sending us in one or more questions by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address that is listed at the bottom of the homepage of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, namely info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question, we reserve the right to edit the wording, and we might decide to use your question in the course of some future webinar. If we do that, the consideration of your question would fall to the entire group of people, not just to me personally. So now we are going to start the substantive part of our discussion today. We are returning to the top of page 6 of Living the Real Religion of Jesus, the essay that I wrote in June, and in particular to 2 quotations that come from papers 92 and 98, in which Melchizedek is describing aspects of Christianity that were heavily influenced by the circumstances of life in Western countries. So even though we read these quotations the last time, I believe it is useful to read them again in order to create a context for our discussion at this point. Stephen, are you able to read the first quotation, which begins, "As the original teachings of Jesus," and so on?
Yes. As the original teachings of Jesus penetrated the Occident, they became Occidentalized. And as they became Occidentalized, they began to lose their potentially universal appeal to all races and kinds of men. Christianity today has become a religion well adapted to the social, economic, and political mores of the white races. It has long since ceased to be the religion of Jesus, although it still valiantly portrays a beautiful religion about Jesus to such individuals as sincerely seek to follow in the way of its teaching. It has glorified Jesus as the Christ, the messianic anointed one from God, but has largely forgotten the Master's personal gospel, the fatherhood of God, and the universal brotherhood of all men.
Thank you. Andre, would you be able to take up and pursue with us the second quotation?
Sure. The Christian religion is the religion about the life and teachings of Christ, based upon the theology of Judaism, modified further through the assimilation of certain Zoroastrian teachings and Greek philosophy, and formulated primarily by three individuals, Philo, Peter, and Paul. It has passed through many phases of evolution since the times of Paul and has become so thoroughly occidentalized that many non-European peoples very naturally look upon Christianity as a strange revelation of a strange God and for strangers.
Thank you, Andre. For the information of the viewers, I previously circulated to the participants a series of 4 detailed questions pertaining to these 2 passages from part 3. Last week, we considered the first of those questions, which I will simply read out for the record to create a context for what follows. The first question read as follows: please analyze and comment on the Melchizedek statements that A, the teachings of Jesus became occidentalized, and B, since the time of Paul, Christianity, quote, has become so thoroughly occidentalized that many non-European peoples very naturally look upon Christianity as a strange revelation of a strange God and for strangers, unquote. Now, we are not going to revert to that question because we did discuss it rather thoroughly last time, the previous webinar a week ago. We began discussing the second question, but did not complete that discussion. I will now read the second question. 2, in your view, what are the factors that led the Melchizedek to declare that Christianity, quote, has become a religion well adapted to the social, economic, and political mores of the white races, unquote? Please interpret this statement by analyzing each of the 3 dimensions that the Melchizedek identifies, i.e., social, economic, and political. Now, gentlemen, I think for the purposes of this discussion, I would like to suggest that we proceed according to those 3 categories. First commenting on social matters, then turning to economic, and then finally to political matters. So I invite comments on the issues of social matters that correspond to this question about the adaptation of Christianity to the practices of the white races. Who would like to talk about social issues? We did discuss last week the point about individualism as opposed to a focus on group relationships that is an integral part of this question in a social sense. So I put that on the table as a background topic that you may wish to return to, but perhaps it might be better if you could supplement it by other factors. Since you were not on the discussion last week, Andre, I wonder if you could comment on social characteristics of Western countries that may influence the way that Christianity has developed and is observed.
Well, thanks, Neil. Some of what, by the way, had this been an essay question on an exam, this would have been one that I would have read as a preview and then gone to the rest of the questions and come back to it.
Save this for the end in the case that you really do have time to write something.
And thinking about it, I'd almost prefer to back up to a more global sense of part of why the Melchizedek is referring to it this way, and maybe less so for the white races and more so for the whole, just the global aspect of the fact that Christianity so largely became imbued with the institutions around it, and that was not right away, but once it it started to make political alliances, and maybe that's what strikes me as the first place to start. But I'll try to get to the social here in a moment. Was that by becoming affiliated with, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and Constantine in the East, it effectively became something that was going to be influenced by those societies, those governments, those institutions. And we're told quite simply that to the extent that a religion does not put religion first, to that extent, what ends up happening is it becomes, religion becomes subsumed to these other kinds of aspects, the social, the economic, and the political. I can never find this quote, and therefore I can only think that this is something that has evolved in my own mind as a digestion of a principle in the Urantia book. But when the greater thing is chosen, the lesser is included, is sort of a precept we get from one of the teachings of the Urantia book, that when we choose religion, it is able to influence all of these other things. It's able to influence the economic, the political, and the social through the individual and his personal relationship with God, and how that morality in that individual is dynamically changing. But there's a converse corollary to this, I believe, and that is when you choose the lesser thing, the greater is excluded. And Christianity largely started to become a set of moral precepts. And as a result of that, as a result of not focusing on the individual's relationship with God, and by having intermediaries in the form of a priest class that was growing up, it started to become that people no longer were authoritative, I'll say it that way. People were no longer authoritative in their own personal religion. They allowed that to be informed by factors outside, and therefore personal religion was either subsumed or went away largely in their practice, or became something that largely conformed to what was dictated by the priest class. So getting back to the social then, what I see having happened I apologize if this is convoluted, so is my current physiology. The social which may have first influenced Christianity was now completely subsumed under that sort of moral, those moral pronouncements that were coming from the ecclesiastical authority that was evolving. And to me, that's some of how globally to begin to understand this, the economics and the political followed. And I know we're going to cover that separately, but I'll leave it at that for right now.
Thank you, Andre. For someone who did not participate last week because you were on overseas escapades, I think you've done very well to come into this midstream, shall we say. I would spin off part of what Andre said, and in effect, combine the ideas of individualism with the group, I should say, with the question of group functioning that became inherent in Christianity. Now, Andre referred to elements of belief and practice, including the clergy and so on. And so I would like perhaps if people could comment a bit about the sociology of belief in terms of the relationship of the believer to the authority principle embodied in the clergy and perhaps bishops in general, because that is different, in my opinion, from the practices of religion in other parts of the world. For example, in Buddhism, there is no affiliation with a particular denomination or clergyman. And I believe that likewise is true in Hinduism, although I am not very versed in the Hindu practices. But in any case, the pattern of social engagement in Christianity did involve very substantial authority on the part of religious leaders, and that distinguishes the religion perhaps from other varieties of faith that appear in other societies. George, could you comment on that?
Yes, although I had prepared a kind of different approach. Instead of going into each of those three items individually, I sort of approached it in a more, in terms of the origin of these institutions, which.
Well, George, I don't want to guide you especially in a particular direction. So if you prefer to adopt the approach that you've just described and respond in that way, that would be fine with me.
All right. Well, thanks. I'll do that. All of these institutions, social, economic, and political, originate in the mores, and in section 4 of paper 64, a Melchizedek tells us that all modern social institutions arise from the evolution of the primitive customs of your savage ancestors. The conventions of today are the modified and expanded customs of yesterday. What habit is to the individual, custom is to the group. End quote. So this is apparently true for all cultures everywhere in the world. So if we look at the, in all these cultures, these traditional customs are those which have been proven to work for it. They're the moral rules of a culture that sustain it and perpetuate it, fulfilling really the imperative for survival, which applies to cultures as well as to individuals. So morality inevitably evolves in every culture. And this evolution in the West has been, as we've been discussing, heavily influenced by the dominance of the Occidentalized version of Christianity. So in thinking about what the Melchizedek is saying in that first quote about Christianity being well adapted to Western civilization, that may have been true in the 1930s, but it's apparent now that the West has entered a post-Christian period. I mean, really, the West is in the process of rejecting its traditional mores and religion, which many now see as socially unjust, economically inequitable, and politically tyrannical. The moral values of secular humanism have increasingly displaced the moral values of Christianity. And there's an objective measure of this displacement. It can be found in the 1933 Manifesto of the American Humanist Association, whose motto is "Good without a God." This manifesto lists 14 goals for secular humanism, all of which are radically at odds with Western mores in the 1930s. Today, none of these are seen as particularly radical, and several have become part of the civil law. Now, the Midwayers warned us of this outcome, or the potential for this outcome. They say in paper 195, and we've gone over this before, Secularism threatens to establish a new and godless type of mastery over the hearts and minds of modern men, end quote. And it really seems apparent that secular humanism has successfully deconstructed and exposed the myths of Christianity and effectively delegitimized its authoritative influence over Western hearts and minds. I really don't think there's any doubt any longer, at least not in my mind, that the West has effectively rejected its traditional religion and become a secular civilization. The midwayers who foresaw all of this counsel us in paper 195, do not overlook the value of your spiritual heritage, the river of truth running down through the centuries, even to the barren times of a materialistic and secular age, end quote. So what truth of lasting value comes down from our past into the spiritual darkness of this godless secular age? Well, for 2 millennia, Christianity has consistently glorified the divine personality of Christ Jesus. In spirit, this is he whom we know and adore as Christ Michael, Son of God and Son of Man. From the last paper, the midwayers write, Paul's Christianity made sure of the adoration of the divine Christ, but it almost wholly lost sight of the struggling and valiant human Jesus of Galilee, who, by the valor of his personal religious faith and the heroism of his indwelling adjuster, ascended from the lowly levels of humanity to become one with divinity. And a second quote, of all human knowledge, that which is of greatest value is to know the religious life of Jesus and how he lived it, end quote. So I think this suggests a possible way forward for the West based upon its spiritual heritage, which we're counseled not to ignore. Christianity is a religion about the divine personality of Jesus, the Son of God. Christianity also carries the unexamined story of the religion of the human personality of Jesus, the Son of Man. This has been largely overlooked, even though Son of Man occurs over 50 times in the New Testament. All of these occur in the 4 Gospels, and in almost every instance, it is used by Jesus to refer to himself. There are just 4 instances in the Gospel where Jesus admits to being the Son of God. This is a very strange fact, since he is first and foremost the divine God, the divine Son of God in Christianity. This fact precipitated what has been known as the Son of Man debate among biblical scholars, which arose in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. Why is this title only used by Jesus? Why don't the apostles or his disciples ever refer to him by this title? What meaning and value does Jesus intend by this self-designation? Why does he almost exclusively use this title? There's nothing like a consensus among Christologists on these questions, despite centuries of intense study, analysis, and debate. As a footnote to this, the Urantia papers actually inform us that Jesus adopted the title Son of Man as his inaugural title for his bestowal mission, after reading a prediction about the Son of Man as the messianic deliverer in the book of Enoch, which he found in the synagogue library at Nazareth. So that's my prepared statement.
Well, let me probe just a little bit of your thoughts, which are very interesting. I'm not clear on your net conclusion concerning the validity of the traditional norms, or if you prefer, moral principles associated with Christianity, as opposed to the current social and cultural emphasis, which is, I believe correctly, more aptly described as secular. So if we take this as a mixture of influences, what is the path forward in your view in trying to interest people in other cultures in the real religion of Jesus?
Well, I think I'm more adhering to the principle that physician, heal thyself. You know, before we go out and heal other people, we need to heal ourselves. So, you know, we're not part of other cultures. We are part of the West. So it seems a little premature for us to think that we can come up with some religion or religious doctrine which will universally appeal to all cultures when we are in fact part of the Western culture. So the principle, what is suggested to me by those two quotes about Paul assuring the adoration of the divine personality of Jesus, and the quote referring to knowledge of the religious life of the personal religious life of Jesus as the most important knowledge. That's, if you take the spirit of those two statements in the book, I think that's where the potential path forward lies. Not in, I mean, you know, Christianity has already been thoroughly, absolutely, and completely deconstructed by secular humanism and postmodern critique. There's nothing left to expose. It's all been exposed. So what hasn't been affected by all of that is the truth of Christ Jesus, or as we know him, Christ Michael. That truth has not been touched by all of this analysis and critique and rejection. None of that has been touched. So that's something in the river of truth coming down to us, which is a potential starting point. If we can expand upon that concept that's already present in our spiritual heritage and add to it some sort of appreciation for the personal religion of Jesus as a human being on this planet. So that really is the point of my my little essay here.
George, thank you for your essay. Thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thank you for addressing the follow-on question that I just gave to you. I would say that my experience with the two people who have commented thus far, Andre and yourself, has emphasized how useless it is for me to try to micromanage the conversation, because you gentlemen have very broad backgrounds and will largely go in directions that seem appropriate to you. I'm not criticizing at all. In fact, I'm commending you. And so this leads me now to call on Stephen and refrain from giving him any kind of a program and merely expecting him to speak in some depth, as is his tradition, on any of the subjects that any of you have referred to already, or for that matter, on any other aspects that commends itself to him.
Well, I appreciate what George just said. That was very, very profound, I think. Also, I didn't realize in the Urantia book that it talks about Jesus finding the first book of Enoch in the Nazareth Library. And that's where he found out about the moniker Son of Man. Now, that's very interesting to me. Also, it should be known that I'm sure he was aware of the same title in the book of Daniel that served very much the same purpose in Jewish eschatology, I think you might call it. So thank you, George. That was interesting. Well, where should I go with this? In looking back on the spread of Christianity around the Mediterranean, what Paul was able to do and what made him such an effective evangelist was that he was able to somehow integrate the universalistic aspects of Christianity. In other words, there's no Jew, no Gentile, no male, no female. In other words, everybody's equal in Christ, with the additional idea that nobody should change what they were in order to become included in the body of Christ. So in other words, everybody was respected for what they were. Jews were respected as Jews. Gentiles were respected as Gentiles. He did not expect Gentiles to become Jews or vice versa. So this principle that he enforced in his evangelization process proved to be very effective. And we might be able to use that, in other words, respecting both the particular of each culture, the particularity of each culture that we try to address with the teachings of the Urantia book, and especially the life of Jesus as it's portrayed there, and respect the viewpoints of the cultures that we're addressing, and let it be a true dialogue, and not that we have, a settled truth in the Urantia book. I mean, one of our main dangers, I think, in possessing a written book, and of course Jesus was quite aware of that, is that when you possess something that's written down in black and white, it has a tendency to ossify in the minds of the believers of that particular book. And as it hardens and stays in black and white, so to speak, it becomes more difficult to let that truth, which is really what inhabits that black and white print, it becomes more and more difficult for the truth to escape the printed page. And that can only be done in a true dialogue between the culture that we're in the West and whatever other cultures that we're trying to go to, let's say the Philippines. So it's got to be more than a one-way street. It's got to be, very much a two-way street. In other words, to take the insights of where we're going and help that evolve our own relationship to what's in the Urantia book. Our understanding of what's in the Urantia book is Occidental. It's delimited, it's culturally delimited. And that will only get us so far, even though the Urantia book is intended for the whole planet. It will not be able to reach the whole planet unless we escape the very same process. I won't call it an error because it's really, in a sense, inevitable. When a book is placed, when a revelation is placed in a particular culture, that revelation becomes acculturated to that culture. It's an oxymoron. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, there's no other way to do it. So if it's going to escape that trap, then the people that we bring it to have to be thoroughly engaged in transforming the truths that we understand. And it's not a matter of what we bring to them, it's what they bring to us as those truths become transformed by each and every cultural group that we interact with. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I wonder if there is a parallel here to the practices that I believe are described as a system of the government and people of the advanced continent and neighboring planet, whereby they pull people from other places into their own culture and then allow them or encourage them to go back with the adaptations and adjustments that may be suitable to their initial home cultures. Do you think there is something to that, Stephen?
Well, possibly. I mean, there's not really enough detail on how that process is really engaged with. As long as those people who go to the dominant culture don't become acculturated in terms of what may be thought of as a superior culture and go back to what they may then perceive as their own inferior culture. I mean, if that takes place, I don't see the advantage. But if somehow there's an addition without a subtraction of their own ability to appreciate their own culture, then that would be an addition to what they are, not just a subtraction.
Let me give you a parallel that is rather political in its overtones, but I think it has a bearing. The question of how China is going to adapt to the world at large and become a brotherly member of the international community has been a topic of considerable debate for 30 or 40 years, since the relative opening up that occurred under Deng Xiaoping. Now, one of these influences that people talked about was the fact that people from China, young people, students, are inclined to come to the United States or to other Western countries for university training, perhaps for advanced degrees, and that absorbing the overtones of Western freedom and democracy, they would then go back to China and improve the totalitarian practices that prevail in their home country. This seems to have been a theory that has not worked out. And the other element is that many of these students who come to the United States or other Western countries to study decide to stay here rather than go back to their homeland for personal reasons that I certainly cannot take issue with. So the point I'm really trying to reach is whether a period of study is a valid idea for adaptation and adjustment on the part of people living in another country. Do you want to take that one, Steve, or would you rather that I put it to a different participant?
I mean, like I said previously, I think potentially it can work, but there's so many dangers inherent in doing that again, the dominant culture, I guess you might call it, has to be very aware that it cannot see itself as a superior culture to kind of overcome and infiltrate the other cultures of the planet. If that takes place, then you have basically a cultural imperialism, which is what's happened on Urantia. So it's a tricky process. And I'd really be interested in more details about that other planet, which of course we're not going to get anytime soon.
Right. Bob, everyone else has taken a turn, and now you have a rich menu of options to discuss or add to as you wish.
Thanks, Neil. Let me start with, yeah, there was quite a bit of rich options, and I did take a very similar approach to this question as George did. And George, if I get anything of what you said incorrect, please don't hesitate to jump in. But George, you talked about the mores of a society to try and get to this to the three parts of it, to the social, economic, and political parts of what the Melchizedek is actually talking about. So I looked up to try and understand where mores and morality fit inside of these three domains. I looked up a little bit of the definition, and I came up with this in various places. Let me just kind of read this here. What are mores? Well, they refer to social norms that are widely observed and are considered to have greater moral significance than others. Mores include an aversion for societal taboos, such as incest, for example. The mores of a society usually predicate legislation reinforcing their taboos. Often countries will employ specialized vice squads or vice police to combat specific crimes offending against societal mores. We've seen this, in the news quite a bit. Morality, however, can be defined as a subset of the mores. That particular more that is of high significance at any particular time in the society, and it's formalized in some sort of a moral code, very often ending up in the political realm and becoming law. So thinking through this idea of occidentalization, I kind of reversed this question a little bit and said, well, what if the Melchizedek had said something like, and let me just read how I wrote it because it was a little bit tricky to do that. I'm still thinking about the occidentalization and orientalization as being two divergent thinking patterns here, and how do the mores actually play a role in both in all three, social, economic, and political. And if it's possible to ask the question in the other direction, we would ask, see how I wrote this thing down here. Let's just take, I took Hinduism as an example of an Oriental religious approach. And as you said, Neil, I'm certainly not any kind of an authority on this, but did do a little bit of research to try and come up with an idea here. So we would say that Hinduism has passed through many phases of evolution, and it's so thoroughly Orientalized that many European peoples would very naturally look upon Hinduism as a strange revelation for strangers. So is that possible? Steve, you had said something interesting. You were sort of talking about other societies and other cultures. I thought you were talking about the Eastern ones. And, in this idea of, how do we integrate, or how do we de-occidentalize, for example, and take the message of Jesus's true teachings as how do we actually de-occidentalize that, I suppose. And I think you said something like, well, we really need to say, what is it that these other cultures and societies bring to us? You talked about, having the students come over and potentially going back, and maybe that really, really hasn't worked. So I did take a look at. There was an article in the Huffington Post by Pandit Dasra. He's a Bhakti Hindu, and lived in New York City and in a monastery for many years, and now he's a business consultant. And he kind of addressed this in the way that I thought was fairly interesting. And the article that he wrote in the Huffington Post, it's a fairly recent one, was called get the actual do Christians see the 33 million gods of Hinduism in a strange way of approaching humanity's spiritual nature? Hinduism has gods for almost everything that the universe has to uphold, and these are demigods with the principle of Brahma as being the highest principle of all. And as he started to explain this in the article, it seems that that these demigods are responsible for a specific area, as I said, in upholding the universe, to keep the universe running. Well, if we look at the Urantia papers and look back to section 1, part 1 and part 2, where where the revelators talk about the universe, there's a pantheon of celestial agents that are part of the Father's plan, that come out of the infinite Spirit, that do various things to uphold the universe. So my thinking is that the this idea of how to integrate these two thinking, maybe de-occidentalization is really wrong, in the fact that the mores are going to dictate a lot of what can't be changed because it's conventional wisdom. So my thinking on all of this was, and to kind of sum this up into all three, socially, economically, and politically, as the world becomes more globally oriented, sports are integrated, politics are severely integrated. The commerce is fully integrated. Potentially, the Urantia papers ought to act as a substrate, and a substrate is that it takes two of these elements and creates another level of either biology or chemistry or whatever. A fish tank has to have a substrate to be able to grow plants at the bottom of it and have the fish actually survive. So a little bit tough to talk about all these high concepts in a very short synopsis here, but I definitely agree that we need to look at this as potentially moving, as George said, into a post-Christian society where the global aspect of this is so fully integrated that I think that we really need to look at integrating or understanding how to integrate both of these ways of approach. And I think that the Urantia papers provide adequate thought for both sides of thinking. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I would like to get your reactions on a thesis basically that comes from the discussion 2 webinars ago, and specifically from comments by our committee colleague, Francois Brunet, who emphasized the fact that the ideas that are at the core of the Urantia book, that are at the core of the revelation, are themselves fairly simple. He emphasized the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and believed that this can be explained quite directly. And that, in effect, if I take a reasonable interpretation of what he said, that it would be reasonable for us to focus intently on those 2 points, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and refrain from adding elements that come from our own society and civilization. What do you think of that?
Is that for me, Neil?
Yes, it is.
Yes, Jesus went out to when he made the trip to Rome. He met with the 35 religious leaders, some of the cynics, and Mithraic leaders at the same time. And the term that the papers use, or I should say that the Midwayer Commission uses, is that he never demonstrated to them or told them that what they were thinking was incorrect. But what he did is he provided them truth. And that truth then crowded out, going back to what Andre said about sometimes the smaller crowds out the larger, so that the messengers that did come through Rome in the future were then able to even though it was a modified truth message from what Jesus gave to the cynics and the Mithraic leaders, it took hold, and that to me was a very interesting cultural aspect of how Jesus was able to crowd out some of the erroneous thinking and untruths that had existed at the time. So I think that's the thought that I had about all that, Neil. So back to you.
Okay, gentlemen, I would like to thank all of you for extremely interesting comments. I confess that my original idea of micromanaging the discussion completely failed, but it's a characteristic of a moderator who is at least somewhat skilled to realize when the panelists are going in a different direction and simply to accept that. So that's what I have done. I would now like to, Stephen, yes, please go ahead.
I just wanted to bring up a brief question. I'm not so sure that any concept that's either in Christianity or in the Urantia book as we have it can be culturally free of what we might call occidentalization. I mean, I think by necessity, it cannot be free. And that includes the idea of the fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man. I'm just trying to imagine taking those ideas to countries, many countries around the world, many cultures, where patriarchy and subjugation of women is very much in practice, even more so than our own culture. And to breach the idea of God in terms of fatherhood, talk about deconstruction of Christianity, I am not confident that those ideas, if not outmoded already, will very quickly become outmoded when they're confronted with realities, the brutal realities of patriarchy in so many, let's just call them less developed societies around the world. I mean, it's bad enough here, but you can imagine in other societies, just for example, Pakistan, how that would go over to half the population who are women. I don't know. I'm just bringing that up. I'm just not convinced that any idea in the Urantia book is free of cultural baggage. And that's something we have to confront.
Stephen, I understand your point. It has, I would say, rather sad implications, because if we take your point completely, it basically amounts to saying that we can't communicate with anyone other than people in our own culture, in effect. And I would be very sad if that's the case. Do you want to?
I don't, that's not what I was saying. I mean, that's what I was talking about before, about having an authentic dialogue and not a one-way discussion. So if we go to another culture and just say, well, these ideas of fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, or even more so, the idea of personal religion, religion of personal spirituality. Many cultures don't experience religion in individualistic terms. They experience it in group terms. So that idea of personal religion is even more culturally loaded. So when I say really listen and really interact in a dialogue, that's a real dialogue, not just, well, here's what we have to say and you can take it or leave it. I don't think that communication is impossible. I just think it's more difficult than we may make it out to be, because we think we have a revelation here. And I'm sure we do, but that doesn't make communication any easier, unfortunately.
Well, I'm somewhat relieved because you have overcome my original impulse that your earlier remarks basically were denying the possibility of communication. You have not said that. You have said that we have to have a process that is interactive and that works in two ways, not just one, coming from us to them, but also listening to them, talking to us, and so on. And I believe that you have hit upon a very important point, and that the technique of discussion indeed has to involve mutual sensitivity and mutual reciprocity. So thank you for these insights. I appreciate them very much. And I will now exercise the prerogative of the moderator to go on to the next prepared question, which I read from the document that I circulated to all of you as follows. Question number 3. The second excerpt begins with the Melchizedek's statement that, quote, the Christian religion is the religion about the life and teachings of Christ, unquote. How does this differ from a much more general remark that the Melchizedek most emphatically did not make, a statement whereby he would declare that the Christian religion is the teachings of Christ? Do the key differences solely pertain to the word about, or do there appear to be other factors that are at least equally important? Bob, you were at the tail end of our previous series, so I give you the option to go at this one first.
Okay, I'll hit this first, Neil. I took a different approach on this because I was a little confused by the use of the term Christ, and I have to go back to a paper that I've kept for a very long time and reread it. It was a paper by a longtime Urantia reader. He's from this area here, Ernest Moyer, and it was called Christ Names in the Urantia Papers. And pretty much he came up with all of the designation, all of the ways that the revelators used the term Christ. And I'm sort of approaching this because the question actually goes to what the Melchizedek does use the word, the term Christ. So now, even though that the paper was actually written as a rebuttal to the claim that the papers were developed and written by humans, which I think that he did a real good job of explaining that it's not. He comes up with 3 basic thoughts, final analysis thoughts here. The first one is that the papers never used the phrases Jesus Christ or Christ Jesus in any of their discussions or any of the pages for the designation for Jesus, except in historical or Christian theological reference. So if we look at the first statement by the Melchizedek, it says that the Christian religion is the religion about the life and teachings of Christ based upon the theology of Judaism, modified further through the assimilation of certain Zoroastrian teachings and Greek philosophy. Well, that's a fact, and in fact, it's a historical fact that Christianity equates Jesus to the Christ. That's not the way that the revelators do that. They equate Michael as the anointed one, and I think what they've done is they've acted as a substrate, as I used that before, where they've taken the evolutionary and historical context and then elevated it into the revelation of the Michaels. That as far as I'm concerned, that's a brand new revelation. Understanding how local universes are built and developed and bestowals actually occur. So that one's a fact. And then the other part of it was the other use of the word Christ is that let's see, how did it go here? It was your question in there, Neil. Sorry, about that you make a supposition, a hypothetical, and you say, how does this differ from a much more general remark that the Melchizedek most emphatically did not make, a statement whereby he would declare that the Christian religion is the teachings of Christ? Well, I would take a little difference with the premise in that part of the question, based upon how I see the revelators using the term Christ, and I would say that he didn't make the statement whereby that the Christian religion is the teachings of Jesus. That's a fact. In fact, it's the life about Jesus and not of Jesus's teachings. So you asked in the last part of that, did the key differences solely pertain to the word about, or do there appear to be other factors? And I think that the factors, in answering the question, I think that the factors are basically pertain back to the use of the term Christ. And it's very subtle, and it's it's the way that I saw that question actually having to be answered. Back over to you.
Thank you. I would simply react somewhat to your focus on the vocabulary by stating that the word Christian already has the name Christ in it. The first syllable of the word Christian is indeed Christ, and then simply the adjectival ending "-en," I-A-N. And so in making this statement, the Melchizedek is adopting the vocabulary of Christianity and treating Christ as the subject of Christianity. So I do not read into it in my own way a theological interpretation of the Melchizedeks. Rather, he is going with the flow of the nature of the institution Christianity by adopting the word Christ as part of those teachings that we call the religion. But in any event, I'm really more interested in the gap, the part that you identified at the end of your comments. What is missing from the Christian religion that was in the true teachings of Jesus, or what is in the religion of Jesus that conflicts? I'm sorry, what is in the Christian religion that conflicts with the true teaching of Jesus? Would you take that?
I would have to defer back to the entire set of our webinars. We're basically approaching that question through the assimilation and the full analysis of the origin, history, and destiny. So I'll defer back to the group on going into the details of that, but there certainly is a gap there, and I think that's what the whole purpose of our webinars are trying to flesh out of this.
Well, thank you, Bob. I would call that a very elegant punt, if you allow me to use a term from football. Stephen, would you take up the issue of this question, addressing it as you see fit?
Well, again, I think that anytime a revelation, in this case, revelation of Christ Michael, anytime that becomes acculturated, you're going to lose things that were obviously included in the original teachings, and you're going to add things that were not in the original teachings. That's just revelation entering the evolutionary stream of religion, and nobody should be surprised about this, and nobody should condemn Christianity per se for it happening in that historical context. That's what happens with divine revelation. Once it enters the human realm, it becomes distorted and delimited. That's how revelation enters mortal existence. So yes, I mean, it's kind of almost a non sequitur, I would say. Is the Urantia book, as it stands, is that the teachings of Christ? Well, we believe so, but you have to remember that the Urantia book, the authors admit that his teachings were modified, translated, and for our own ability to understand what he said in first century Jewish terms. So we don't have the original teachings of Christ either. We have a modification based on our cultural and religious needs in 20th century America. So the idea that their teachings of Christ exist out there in some protected sphere that is not prone to human utilization and modification, I just don't think that's a valid standard to judge any religious interpretation of a revelation. That's just what happens with revelation.
Stephen, these remarks of yours are quite similar to some that you made last week, and therefore I take the liberty of pushing you slightly on what you've just said. I think I already know the answer, but it is usually the technique preached to attorneys that they should not ask a question unless they already know the answer. So I will ask the question. Are you in effect saying that in your view, the Urantia book amounts in the parts that pertain to Jesus to the interpretation of the Midway Commission and the other revelators of the teachings of Jesus rather than the teachings themselves. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, by necessity. There's no way around that.
So they are interpreting it as best they understand it themselves and then express their understanding in the English language. Is that essentially a paraphrase of your view?
And not only that, but they're targeting it to a specific demographic, so to speak, a specific cultural and religious demographic, which in this case is the Forum in Chicago. So they could better deal with what was being told to them. So yes, very, very, very much modified and targeted. And the original teachings of Jesus, we will never know what they are. And if we did know what they are, they wouldn't mean all that much to us, not as much as the Urantia book means, because they were targeted to our culture. And Jesus' teachings were targeted to his culture. And those are the true teachings of Jesus. We have a modified version.
Thank you. Indeed, you have justified my anticipation of what I thought you would say, but I appreciate your elaborating on this. It may be difficult for viewers. It may be difficult for readers of the Urantia book to grapple with the point that you have made, but I believe that there are valid reasons for emphasizing the idea of interpretation and indeed the idea of targeting that you have expressed. George, would you like to leap into this discussion?
I've largely made my position clear, but I would like to respond a little bit to what you said, Stephen. I agree with the facts of what you have stated. Strictly speaking, we will never know the actual words, language, and conceptual matrix in which Jesus presented his teachings. However, I feel that the spirit of the teachings presented to us in the Urantia book faithfully portray his true intent. So while agreeing with you in terms of the technical analysis that you've presented of your opinion of the language in the Urantia book, I nevertheless feel that the spirit and meaning of the teachings is faithfully portrayed, which is why Jesus more than once says, my teaching is for my whole universe. I have sheep not of this flock. So I don't think it's exactly accurate to say that the teachings of Jesus presented 2,000 years ago are irrelevant to anyone else who was anywhere else in the universe at any time. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, George. You have, in tandem with Stephen, partly portrayed the virtues of pluralism and diversity. And I think that our series of webinars is much more valuable to the viewers by presenting a variety of opinions. And I appreciate your cogent analysis also. Andre, I would like to turn to you now. I have to explain the sequence of events because I gave you the first opportunity in the previous round. And so now it seems almost poetic justice to put you at the end of the discussion. But the fact that you are at the end of the discussion gives you quite a range of possible avenues for your remarks. I hope that you will talk about the idea of a gap that I used in my earlier discussion with Bob. In other words, the difference between simply looking at the word about or the question of whether there is a gap either because of insertions or deletions that have occurred in the process of the Christian tradition compared with the original teachings of Jesus as he intended them.
Well, it's in some ways, your question, I think, for this group is asked and answered. You know, most of us would come from the perspective that yes, there have been deletions and insertions in the Christian teachings that have, whether they've been occidentalized, whether they've been attenuated, however we want to refer to that, you know, both have happened, obviously. But they largely have thwarted through the fact that Christianity is largely a religion that is pervades secondhand and that requires ecclesiastical authority in order for it to be pervade to its adherents. Okay. Its adherents, and again, I apologize for the slowness of my thought articulation today. They're no longer teaching the truth that Jesus taught, that God is your father, and therefore all men and women are your brothers and sisters. That's not being taught in Christianity. That would hearken back to declare that Christian religion is the teachings of Christ. No, they're not. They are not the teachings of Christ in that sense. They miss the key note. They miss the complete desire to remove intermediaries as well. The idea of, if I have a personal relationship with God, of what need is an intermediary of any kind for me in purveying my religion. Now, we haven't gotten to see that there could be such a useful intermediary who would be trained as a minister to help people get to the place of having their own personal relationship with God. Because there has not been, in my view, a religion. Well, I mean, Buddhism does this, but it does it without a God. Okay, so, all right, baby out with bathwater. And you perhaps have other sects that have somehow gotten to the truth around that. But the fact that Christianity does not teach that means that ultimately it allows every sect to perpetuate the illusion that there's an us and there's a them. There's those that believe as we believe, and there's those that don't. And as far as we know, those that don't are not going to where we're going. And so long as we have that kind of mindset perpetuated, and furthermore, so long as we have a viewpoint perpetuated that says belief is what's important and not how I live according to a truth, we have problems, because we cannot unify. We'll always be divided in the realm of belief. That's part of the teachings of the Urantia book, but that's part of Experience on Earth 101. Okay, for anybody paying attention, there's no way that you line up with everybody on the basis of beliefs, but you can line up with everybody on the basis of goals and values. And the main goal and value are in the teachings of a loving God who loves all of his children, and that therefore all of his children should, in faith, regard that love as sufficient reason for them to look at their fellows as brothers and sisters on the face of the earth. That's an answer to that. but there have been so many wonderful comments by everybody else that some of them just can't be let go. And I don't think I can get to all of them because they're just, there's a maelstrom of thought around all your wonderful comments. But let me just start with Stephen for a minute. There's an interesting contrast in Stephen's viewpoint of, on the one hand, you know, teachings become imbued with the culture in which they occur. Clearly, that's true. But contrast that with the viewpoint of the university students, the Chinese students, with whom we could not imbue our culture to take over back to China, that somehow that doesn't occur. I would take a little bit of umbrage with that. I think it's largely true. But on the other hand, they are imbued with our culture. They do go over. What happens though is they cannot help but purvey what is of cultural value to them. And so what do we see that's developed in China today? A remarkable development of materialism. That has been purveyed excellently in China. They've carried that over well. They've carried over standard of living well. They understand they'd like that to grow in the culture. What is disallowed in the culture, that is free political thought, that has not been purveyed. That has not changed, although that has been there to begin with in the first place. It's just suppressed. Or a good portion of it went over and, with the national movement to Formosa, AKA Taiwan, with Chiang Kai-shek, and perpetuates that there in that culture. And I guess what strikes me there is that we ought to pay attention that it's not always an either or. There is an influence that occurs. Secondly, I'd also state that we're not the dissemination of the Urantia teachings are not entirely subject to how those who have initially received them purvey them. So yes, it's largely been Westerners that have first taken on the Urantia teachings, but among us as Westerners, and that includes different racial groups, different cultural groups. Some of those cultural groups have gone back to their original cultures. I've just had the experience that I can convey quite freshly, having just literally returned yesterday from a trip to the Philippines, in which two of our members in Chicago who are Filipino, many know Eugene and Belén Asidao, they have gone back to the Philippines and have made it their mission to promulgate the Urantia teachings over there, and to do it with a knowledge, and having come from that culture, they are able to do it in such a way that they are not actually so much disseminating the teachings as disseminating the teachings, inviting people to participate, but also understanding that the culture itself acts as a medium in conveying the teachings. And I'm less of a medium today in conveying this idea to you, but let me give you one example. Family culture in the Philippines is robust. It is a solid family culture. And as a result of that, when somebody picks up the teachings there, they move with those teachings. They move throughout the family. Not only that, there is such a family feel among Filipinos in general that easily in conversation, something gets brought up, somebody gets interested. If they get to know the person, they may get curious just on their own as a result of being talked about certain things or truths, or about the Urantia book. I had that experience with Eugene just talking to the taxi driver on the way to the airport. It was just like, there was no thought about it. There was no, should I talk about it? Should I not talk about it? That might occur in the mind of us in the United States, depending on an assessment of somebody's receptivity. It's just a matter of putting it out there and seeing whether or not it's appropriated. In this way, over the last 20 years, the Urantia book has found its way into various people's hands. Also, just by the visit of John Hales and Berkeley Elliott back perhaps 25 years ago, the teachings have made that was a beginning insemination of the teachings there that has borne fruit. And we ought to realize that these kinds of things occur. And finally, I'll say, very similar to what Stephen is saying, and I would love to get to some of the things that George said too, but you're the moderator, and I respect that, Neil. Stephen pointed out, again, the idea of how a culture takes it on. Well, this is happening in Filipino culture, and it's going to be its own kind of purveying of the revelation. But let me tell you, the level of study that is going on among just regular Filipinos that have embraced the teachings, and the family culture that is there, is something that we will be able to learn from and ought to pay attention to, because the stalemate that we have largely arrived at with the spread of the Urantia teachings in North America is not a problem elsewhere in the world. There are places that are hungry.
Andre,
I have plenty of other things to say.
I understand, and I appreciate your restraint in recognizing that I have certain obligations as a moderator to keep the discussion going and to give everyone a chance. Bob, I will recognize you in just a moment. I just saw your finger go up. But I would like briefly to react to part of what Andre said in good measure. The concept that Chinese students returning to China have absorbed materialism and have conveyed it in China is partly true, but I would say that they have simply taken the materialism of contemporary life in the United States or other Western countries and have gone back to China in ways that reinforce the original and natural inclination of Chinese culture, which has been materialistic for at least the last 2,000 years. I studied Mandarin Chinese in my years with the State Department, and the tradition of getting wealthy is very deep in Chinese psychology. So they did not need to pick that up from us. I will tell you for sure. Bob, you wanted to contribute?
Yes, Neil, thanks. I did punt, and I want to go back just real quick. I'll make it brief here. I know that we've talked about this a lot here, but you had mentioned what is the gap, and with everything that's been said, I got thinking about the atonement concept. Well, that's a solid Christian in all sects. It's a solid Christian belief and part of the theology. And of course, we know that the divine counselor takes umbrage with that seriously early in part, I believe it's part 2 of the papers. That's definitely not a teaching of Jesus. So there's some things that are not in part 4 that are in, and we could do a 2x2 or a side-by-side and start to look at these things. But I think what's been said is that at the macro level, we've got culture and we've got all these other things that are that have to be considered. We've got a global movement going on, as we've all talked about a little bit. But my last thought on this is that we read part 4 if we study the entire papers with parts 1, 2, and 3 in mind. So when there is a quote from the Midweyer Commission, of course, they're only the recorders, that essence has to be, as a student, that student will portray that statement in line with the cosmology in papers 1, 2, and 3. And that's my last thought on that. And that's why I believe that the papers, that the book itself will have to act as a substrate, integrating both East and West thought. Back over.
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that you have given us an elaboration on your original reaction. And I think that the question of the atonement is a huge gap or a huge imposition on the true teachings of Jesus that needs to be overcome, for sure. Gentlemen, I would now like to close discussion of question 3 and proceed to question 4 on my list, which actually has 3 subparts. The question reads as follows: 4, please identify and analyze those aspects of Christianity that can be traced to A, the theology of Judaism, B, certain Zoroastrian teachings, C, Greek philosophy. And obviously we have to take this one by one. So I invite comment on aspects of Christianity that can be traced to A, the theology of Judaism. Stephen, as a person who has studied both the history of Christianity and the tradition of Judaism very intently, I think it is logical for me to recognize you first.
Okay, well, I'll start off by saying that Judaism did not have a theology until it was exposed to Hellenistic influences. Let's say around 3rd century BC is when Hellenism started to influence Jewish religion in that way. So theology of Judaism is really the Hellenistic influence on Judaic religious practice. So Judaism was a practice. It was not even really a collection of beliefs as it was a liturgical practice. So that did change when it became exposed to Hellenism. Theology of Judaism, obviously it's monotheism is probably the primary aspect, but another primary aspect that is just as important as monotheism is that the Jewish people were in a covenant with their God. And that covenant was a loving relationship. And that is what gave the Jewish people their identity as a people. They were one people and they were in covenant with one God. And that is the primary aspect of that. That about sums it up, really. The rest is table trimmings, I think. You have a prophetic tradition in Judaism where the prophets were intent on keeping the Jewish people faithful to their God. And faith in the Jewish religion was not a matter of belief. It was a matter of action. It was a matter of moral action, and faithfulness and righteousness and moral action were all the same. There was really no such thing as a belief system separate from the practice of the Jewish religion. And all these things would go into, for instance, the writings of Paul and the workings of Paul in his evangelization, and in the writings of the Gospels. They were Jewish works of literature written by Jews, in some cases for Jews, in some cases for Gentiles, some cases for both. But they incorporated the whole idea of covenant with a single God, a loving Father, and it's not really correct. I think Andre said something that Christianity did not include the idea of God as Father. I think he said that. Sorry if I'm mistaken. Well, that's not accurate. God as Father is as old as the Jewish religion and was carried into the Christian religion and has never left the Christian religion. The other thing I'd say about Jewish religion, as opposed to theology per se, is that Jewish religion was not an individual endeavor. It was a group endeavor. And when you have a group endeavor, you need organization. You need ecclesiology. There is no such thing as a group religion or a cult, as the evangelical would call it, without some sort of organization. And you can call that organization an impediment. You can call it an intermediary. You can also call it a means of accessing the God you're worshiping as a group. Because without some kind of external organization, group religion does not function. So I don't really agree with the idea that group religion, I mean, there's a prejudice in the evangelical movement against group religion. We all know that. And by extension, against ecclesiology. Now, ecclesiology obviously has its shortcomings. We all know that from 2,000 years of Christianity. But you cannot have group religion without some form of ecclesiology, as opposed to ecclesiasticism. So the Urantia book uses the word ecclesiasticism, but that is different than ecclesiology, or the idea of ecclesia. Ecclesia is a congregation. That's where the word comes from. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I would like to follow up in one regard that you have mentioned. You talked about the principle of a covenant, and I certainly am not disputing that as an element of the Hebrew tradition. Indeed, the revelators talk about the relationship between Abraham and Melchizedek, and perhaps Abraham's understanding that he had a special role and his descendants would have a special role in regard to the substantive teachings that Melchizedek was putting forward. But I would like to turn the idea of covenant into the direction of chosen people and effectively ask you to comment on that, but most emphatically in regard to the concept of chosen people as it was imported into Christianity, whereby Christians became convinced that they were the elite of God, that God favored them, that the others in the world around them definitely had a secondary role, were inferior, were not favored. And so what, in effect, I'm asking you to comment on is the degree to which the concept of a chosen people has itself become an integral part of the Christian teachings with certain negative effects.
Yeah, it's ironic, you know, when Paul, as a Jew, basically founded Christianity, he had to deal with the idea of Jews as the chosen people. And what he did was transform that idea into saying that not only are Jews the chosen people, everybody is the chosen people. And there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles, Gentiles being non-Jews. And so he totally universalized the idea of the chosen people, which is really a revolutionary act on his part. Unfortunately, people being people and people being very imperfect as they are, transformed Paul's idea into, once again, an idea of superiority. And that has as much to do with cultural prerogatives and political prerogatives and military prerogatives and economic prerogatives, as it had to do with the idea that Christianity by nature was in some way restrictive in the idea of who's part of God and who has a relationship with God. I think that the ideals of Paul were distorted historically, and I would have to say probably inevitably, because people are what they are and people like to lord it over other people who are not like they are. So I agree with you that chosen people concept does have negative aspects to it in Christianity, but Christianity started out with trying to overcome that kind of distorted idea of who are the chosen people.
Thank you, George. I would like to turn to you and offer you at your discretion certainly any opportunity to comment on what Stephen and I have been discussing, but I would, in addition, ask you to comment on the relationship of morality and a strict moral code descended from Judaism into Christianity as, in effect, a legacy that had an important role, but also some significant disadvantages, in effect, constraining the view of God strictly to a moral level.
Oh, funny you should mention that. That was the first thing I was going to point out. There are a couple of quotes, one from paper 5 and one from paper 121. Paper 5, the Hebrew concept, God as a vindicator of moral values, a righteous God. And then in paper 121, it says Paul's cult of Christianity exhibited its morality as a Jewish birthmark. So there you have it, from the authority itself, the Urantia book. But the issue that you brought up about what this intense focus on righteousness or right behavior, moral behavior, the intense focus on it has tended to obscure the other spiritual attributes of the personality of God, such as truth, beauty, goodness, truth, beauty, and love. So I don't want to get ahead of you. I know you sent out that thing this afternoon. Do you want me to go on, or do you want to take it from here?
Well, I offer you the option. If you wish to start reading that excerpt that I circulated from paper 2, I would be happy to yield to you for that purpose. Would you like to start that?
Yeah, if you give me a second to bring it up.
Fine. This is, for the sake of our viewers, an excerpt from section 7 of paper 2, in which the divine counselor starts with the phrase, the great mistake of the Hebrew religion. And in effect, the divine counselor portrays the almost single-minded focus on goodness as a shortcoming because it did not include adequate and appropriate attention to truth and beauty as the other two elements, nor indeed the result of God's love. So George, if you are available now, could you read the first 2 paragraphs, the great mistake and the religious challenge?
I can. The great mistake of the Hebrew religion was its failure to associate the goodness of God with the factual truths of science and the appealing beauty of art. As civilization progressed, and since religion continued to pursue the same unwise course of overemphasizing the goodness of God to the relative exclusion of truth and neglect of beauty, there developed an increasing tendency for certain types of men to turn away from the abstract and dissociated concept of isolated goodness. The overstressed and isolated morality of modern religion which fails to hold the devotion and loyalty of many 20th century men, would rehabilitate itself if, in addition to its moral mandates, it would give equal consideration to the truths of science, philosophy, and spiritual experience, and to the beauties of the physical creation, the charm of intellectual art, and the grandeur of genuine character achievement. The religious challenge of this age is to those far-seeing and forward-looking men and women of spiritual insight who will dare to construct a new and appealing philosophy of living out of the enlarged and exquisitely integrated modern concepts of cosmic truth, universe beauty, and divine goodness. Such a new and righteous vision of morality will attract all that is good in the mind of man and challenge that which is best in the human soul. Truth, beauty, and goodness are divine realities, and as man ascends the scale of spiritual living, these supreme qualities of the eternal become increasingly coordinated and unified in God, who is love.
George, I'm not sure whether I should congratulate you for reading this or prefer to congratulate the divine counselor for writing it. I think there's some credit that goes to both of you. Naturally, we give precedence to the divine counselor. To me, this is one of the crucial elements in explaining the difference between the fifth epical revelation and the traditional focus on morality that has become a characteristic of Christianity. And please allow me to clarify that remark by stating that I consider morality to be a very important element of spiritual adaptation. The point is not to disregard morality, but to supplement it. That we are not disassociating religion from the idea of goodness, but we would like also to associate truth and beauty. And that includes, of course, science and art and other disciplines. Bob, I would ask you to evaluate one particular point that emerges from the first sentence of the second paragraph that George read. And the point that I would like you to comment on is the implicit contrast and perhaps the paradox of having the divine counselor talk about a religious challenge, and I stress the word religious, as opposed to a philosophy of living. It's interesting that a religious challenge is described as the development of a philosophy. What is the relationship here between religious and philosophy?
Well, philosophy, to me, is in the center of both cosmology and religion. So philosophy to me synthesizes both religion and cosmology. And without philosophizing, the individuals, I shouldn't say, because it's always good to have a philosophical conversation with not just yourself, with other individuals. I think we sometimes do this here in the webinar. Because it guides the interpretation and development of concepts. I have to go back to what I said, I guess in the last go round, where I felt that the first three parts of the revelation provide us a framework, a scaffolding that I know I never had, and even though that I may have taken out of Catholicism. The fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, I really had no cosmic picture, and frankly, this revelation takes us all the way to paradise. It teaches us about the grand universe, about Havona, things that seem to be pure revelation. Time and space, the ultimate. It's got everything that you could possibly want in more than one lifetime. And I suspect when we graduate to the mansion worlds, we're probably going to be taking up some of these concepts with a better mind. So this philosophy has to incorporate both all three concepts of truth, beauty, and goodness, which is being outlined. Now there's other triads, thinking, feeling, and doing, so on and so forth. So I've actually forgot your original question right now, Neil, but I think that sums up what my thoughts were about all that.
Thank you. I would supply another triad or trio, if you prefer, matter, mind, and spirit, one which we have been discussing too. Let me turn to Andre and ask him to comment on the implied paradox that a religious challenge is to develop a philosophy of living. Why is developing a philosophy of living a religious challenge?
That's a really good question. Though I think all of us, after having read paper 160, would agree that it is important. It's essential, actually. We have to have an art of living, and to me, when the Urantia book is describing philosophy, they may be starting with what we're terming philosophy in terms of what we understand as the abstract musing about morality, not musing, but logical thinking about morality, and coming to conclusions that may not be apparent from the initial axioms, that kind of thing. They really are going much, much further and saying this is a means of composing what is a material experience for human beings and the inner spiritual experience, and coming to a sense of how it is that we ought to be living in the world, not just one way, but any number of ways. And that's why I think they're asking us to do this. And the reason it's a religious challenge is if you truly wish to grow in the sense that the Urantia book is urging us to grow, and that is to really, really find God in this life and to really have contact with God in this life, which, very few people really get to in this life, really have that kind of balanced life experience. One has to be doing more than working on one's spiritual experience, paradoxically, as you say. The psychic circles, the mastery of the psychic circles has to do somewhat with achieving success, whatever that success is, in the material realm for ourselves. And I don't mean that means you're able to make a living, although that I think that's part of it. It is a matter of, if you've decided that you, for instance, wanted to be a good economist, or you wanted to be a good cosmetologist, okay, someone who really beautifies other people nicely and makes them feel good about themselves. Whatever it is you've chosen in your life, to some extent, composing that with your relationship with God is all important, and weaving that into a way of life that makes it work for you is all important. And part of the problem that we have in our society is that religions presume, organized religions have presumed to say there's one way to do this. And this is the primary way to be moral. And there really aren't any other ways for you to do this. And if you don't conform to this, you're really not being a good whatever, Jew, Christian, Muslim. In the Abrahamic religions, it's clear that morality is fairly rigid. You have to be a certain way, and it's hard to be like for instance, what do rich people do when you read something like it is easier for or it's harder for a rich man, to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle, whether you take that as the literal or the historical reference, right? Either way. So to me, the Urantia book provides us with a knowledge that not only must we evolve our own individual art of living around this, which is to me synonymous for dynamic individual philosophy of living, but portrays the fact that even on Paradise, there are 70 divisions of philosophy. Among the Univitatia, there are 70 different varieties that we get to live with that I'm sure are going to convey to us that there are literally 70 major different ways that people can live. Okay? And that's part of what we're going to be enlightened to and disabused of the idea of our own personal approach to living as the only way of approaching that. I hope that answers some of what you were trying to get at.
Well, you've more than answered my original question. You've added quite a few additional thoughts to it. I appreciate it very much. Now, I would like, in effect, to interrupt our consideration of these 4 paragraphs from paper 2 by a divine counselor by reading a paragraph from paper 132 during Jesus' sojourn at Rome that mentions this idea of a philosophy of living. And in this case, it is Jesus speaking himself to Gonad, the father of the young man Gani, with whom Jesus was in daily contact. And this particular paragraph is in section 7 of paper 132, paragraph 5 of that section by the Midweyer Commission. And the paragraph consists of Jesus speaking to Gonad. He says, "You see, Gonad, Buddha knew God in spirit, but failed clearly to discover him in mind. The Jews discovered God in mind, but largely failed to know him in spirit. Today, the Buddhists flounder about in a philosophy without God, while my people are piteously enslaved to the fear of a God without a saving philosophy of life and liberty. You have a philosophy without a God. The Jews have a God, but are largely without a philosophy of living as related thereto. Buddha, failing to envision God as a spirit and as a father, failed to provide in his teaching the moral energy and the spiritual driving power which a religion must possess if it is to change a race and exalt a nation." Well, gentlemen, I submit to you that Jesus's comments to Gonad in this paragraph are very similar in tone to the remarks by divine counselor about the need for a philosophy of living. And Jesus, in effect, said that this was a defect of his own background. The Jewish faith that he was raised in did not have a philosophy of living as part of it. So if we look upon the theology of Judaism as coming into Christianity by implication, by heritage, this is a gap in Christianity too, it seems to me. Stephen, would you be willing to comment at this point?
Well, we have to remember that Christianity was composed of not only Judaism, but also of Hellenism, which very much had not only philosophy, but philosophies of living. Stoicism, for instance, is a classic example of that. Epicureanism is another philosophy of living. Cynicism is another philosophy of living. So Christianity inherited those as well. Whether they ended up getting their rightful place in the religion is another issue that we can discuss. But all those things went into Christianity. So I just want to make sure we don't go overboard on all this. Remember that in this first paragraph, they talk about the same unwise course of overemphasizing the goodness of God to the relative exclusion of truth and neglect of beauty. Okay, so that word relative is important. I mean, after we're done here, I'm going to go listen to a performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. And that is as an important part of Christianity as any moral strictures might be, as is all the great art that Christian civilization has produced. So we shouldn't fall into the trap of dichotomous thinking here. Christianity is just as much Hellenistic with all its benefits and detractions as it is Hebraic as well.
Thank you. In effect, Stephen, you've given us a prelude or a preview, perhaps, of comments that will fall under sub-question 4C, the element of Greek philosophy as a contribution to Christianity too. And I appreciate your remarks. I would congratulate you on your plan to attend a performance of Bach's Mass. Was that correct?
St. Matthew Passion.
St. Matthew Passion, yes. I would say to you, as a matter of my own personal taste, that is certainly something I would prefer to attending an opera by Philip Glass, which was something that you threatened me with a few weeks ago, at least as a schedule that your wife had arranged unbeknownst to you. I would like now to ask Bob to read the final 2 paragraphs of the 4 paragraphs by Divine Counselor, if you are able. They begin with the words, all truth, material, philosophic, or spiritual. Bob, could you do that for us?
Sure, Neil. All truth, material, philosophic, or spiritual, is both beautiful and good. All real beauty, material art, or spiritual symmetry, is both true and good. All genuine goodness, whether personal morality, social equity, or divine ministry, is equally true and beautiful. Health, sanity, and happiness are integrations of truth, beauty, and goodness as they are blended in human experience. Such levels of efficient living come about through the unification of energy systems, idea systems, and spirit systems. Truth is coherent, beauty attractive, goodness stabilizing. And when these values of that which is real are coordinated in personality experience, the result is a high order of love conditioned by wisdom and qualified by loyalty. The real purpose of all universe education is to effect the better coordination of the isolated child of the worlds with the larger realities of his expanding experience. Reality is finite on the human level, infinite and eternal on the higher and divine levels.
Thank you. Excuse me. I would comment that this group of 2 paragraphs, in effect, amounts to emphasizing the unity of all elements, truth, beauty, and goodness, and the fact that they interrelate with each other in our experience. You commented earlier, Bob, on the relationship between parts 1, 2, and 3 to the teachings of part 4. And in effect, the final words of this set of 4 paragraphs that you just read establishes the relationship. Reality is finite on the human level, infinite and eternal on the higher and divine levels. And the philosophic depiction of these levels is certainly a key part of the revelation. So I would say to you and to all of my other colleagues that, in effect, the Divine Counselor is telling us about a kind of unity. In some senses, it resembles the focus on the psychic circles that Andre mentioned earlier. the idea of bringing all life, all aspects of life into balance as part of a growth of a human being. Andre, would you like to revert to that, or perhaps turn it in a different direction?
Which would you like to comment on particularly with regard to that?
I give you carte blanche.
Oh my goodness gracious. I guess with regard to maybe focus on where you'd like to go, because that would help me to get a handhold on.
I would, all right, if you want me to give you a prescription here, I will do it very gently.
Yeah.
I would like you to focus on the idea of the unification of truth, beauty, and goodness, in effect, corresponding to love,
Yeah.
as opposed to focusing solely on goodness.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So, to me, the teaching of the Urantia book is wonderful in this regard. You know, in that it's in this particular section, the divine counselor is interweaving and showing its complementary nature with truth, you know, truth with beauty and goodness, etc. The way it's done in those paragraphs, but the idea is to take it to our personal experience and see how is it we actually live this. And Stephen just suggested that, you know, part of that is by you know, looking at how something has inspired art and actually enjoying that art as it illuminates the goodness of what has come out of Christianity, and that would be a great example. I think in other ways, there's an interesting statement that I've always looked at as sort of like an intermediary between that the comments on truth, beauty, and goodness, and somehow bridging it to love. And that would be the statement in paper 196, I believe, where it states that Jesus not only looked at God as true, beautiful, and good, but Jesus looked at God as also holy, just, and great. And I've often looked at that as almost a preliminary interweaving of two of the qualities in different ways. And you can look at them differently. This is not a by any means a perfect kind of thing, but there seems to be a blending of qualities in looking at holiness almost as truth and beauty interwoven, or justice as goodness and truth interwoven, and greatness as beauty and goodness interwoven, and that they're interwoven on a higher, we may find that these are actually the beginning finite appreciation of absonite qualities in that vein that lead to love. So I think of magnanimity, you know, and how can I become a more magnanimous person? That would be part of, you know, the beautiful goodness and greatness. How can I become more holy? What is that interweaving of the livability of truth with its beautiful aspects? Do I focus on the beauty in that way? Or is it just a matter of, by living a righteous life in partnership with God, that holiness ensues? You know, there are all kinds of questions come to mind. I won't go around the carousel, you know, too much more, lest I devolve into word salad.
Well, Andre, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments, and I perhaps would like to put on the record the fact that you are recovering from jet lag, having just returned from the Philippines. And so The fact that you are willing to leap into this
And a summer
discussion,
cold.
and a summer cold, leap into this discussion with only a day to recover from your trip is a testament to your devotion and to your dedication to the revelation and the teachings. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
George, Stephen, I'll recognize you in just a minute. I wanted to turn to George for a different purpose. George, in the first paragraph that you read, the divine counselor expressed regret at the failure to associate the goodness of God with the factual truths of science and the appealing beauty of art. Now, I think the need to integrate the factual truths of science is a point that, if I understand your own personal interests and inclinations, appeals to you very much. And we, of course, are coming off of perhaps 100 years of apparent confrontation between organized religion and some elements of science. I wonder if you could comment on the ability that we have as students of this revelation to overcome that gap or that apparent conflict.
Well, this has been a concern of mine for some time, primarily because of this close relationship between the two. Both pursue truth. Religion and science both pursue truth. But we've been told ever since the Enlightenment that there is no way to reconcile the two. This is just a given. This is now a traditional convention in Western civilization. I don't know about other cultures, but that's the convention that has prevailed almost without question. And when I came across the Urantia book many years ago, one of the first things that struck me was all of the scientific thought within it. I was not the only one who was interested in that fact, but it wasn't until much later that I began examining, for instance, the cosmology in the book. And I can say, as far as I'm concerned, I've found real substantial evidence that the cosmological model of a revolving universe is accurate, is more accurate, a better scientific theory than the current scientific theory of a Big Bang. I'm not going to bore everybody with the details, but just to say that as far as I personally am concerned, I now feel that I have the proof that I need individually, as a matter of my own personal experience, that the science in the Urantia book, the high level scientific thought in the Urantia book, is superior to the current level of scientific thought on this planet. And to me, that establishes a philosophical link. In other words, they told us, they've been telling us ever since we've started reading this, that both pursue truth and that they're not incompatible. And now, as far as I'm concerned, I've satisfied myself that that is true.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to Stephen, who asked to speak.
Just real quick, I had a thought when Andre was speaking and comparing those three qualifiers, truth, beauty, and goodness, with, I think you said holiness, righteousness, and greatness. Is that what it was?
Holiness, justice, and greatness.
Justice and great. Okay. So it struck me that the first three, truth, beauty, and goodness, are very, very much Greek philosophical terms. The latter three, holiness, justice, and greatness, are very much Jewish or Hebraic terms in how they related to God. So I thought that was an interesting contrast between those two. It is also interesting that the Urantia book very much seems to favor the Greek formulation of these approaches to a philosophical living. and as contrasted with holiness, justice, and greatness. So I thought that was interesting. I would just also add that when they say the religious challenge of this age in creating a philosophy of living, it's not only a religious challenge, it's a social challenge, it's a cultural challenge, it's an economic challenge, it's a political challenge. It's not only a religious challenge. So I just want to put that in there too.
Thank you very much. As always, you've highlighted additional elements that deserve our attention and consideration. I would say that we have had an extremely interesting discussion. This is the time for us to wrap it up. But we have not concluded our discussion of element 4A in my series of questions. I think there are still additional aspects of the theology of Judaism that have contributed to Christianity that we need to discuss. In particular, I call your attention to an excerpt that I circulated a few weeks ago pertaining to the distortions in the Old Testament, the idea of a fiction of sacred history. This is material which in effect I pulled out of a succeeding page of Revelation Revealed, pages actually 112 and 113. And I would like to include that concept of a fiction of sacred history and its implications for the development of Christianity as part of our conversation next week when we resume. So gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I greatly look forward to our continuation next week.
Thank
Likewise.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks very much.
Bye.